Good evening. First of all, let me make sure that everybody understands that I am not Dan Benjamin. My name is Wolfgang Ischinger. I happen to have been a member of the board of the American Academy, a proud member of the board, and I am standing in today because Dan is out sick and sends his warm regards and regrets very much that he's not here personally this evening. It's my privilege, my pleasure to welcome you all and those who are participating in this virtually to this evening's event. Tonight's lecture will be delivered by Michael Abramowitz, the president of Freedom House and the current American Academy's Berlin Prize Fellow. He will talk about the accelerating trend of the fight between authoritarianism and democracy and freedom, and what challenges this poses. I happen to believe that that is one of the most fundamental challenges in our time. Quite frankly, let me do a little bit of advertising for my own group, the Munich Security Conference. About 2 years ago, we published this report, which unfortunately was uniquely destined to a German audience. So it exists only in the German version, Zeitenwende, which means the end of an era, the beginning of a new one, a break, a historic break, and I want to say that in this paper, we mention Freedom House in our attempt to describe that democracy and freedom and human rights, the values associated generally with what we call the West, are actually beginning to be or have been on the defensive rather than on the offensive. The number, as Freedom House has shown in its annual reports, the number of countries that you can credibly put in the category of Western, of democracies, has been in decline over more than a decade now. And the number of autocratic governments has been on the rise. In other words, we need to defend what we have, or we need to defend what we believe we have. And how that can be done, how it needs to be done, is currently being illustrated by something which I thought would never really happen in the European theater after the demise of the Soviet Union 31 years ago, namely a war in Europe, which is, quite frankly, at least in my humble opinion, not a war about Ukraine, and certainly not a war about whether Ukraine should or should not be or must not be a member of NATO. So it is really more a conflict between an authoritarian view of how the world should be organized and our attempt to defend the system that we thought we had successfully erected, not only in the European context, through, let's say, the Helsinki Final Act in the 1970s, the Charter of Paris of 1990, and subsequent documents, including, by the way, the so-called NATO-Russia Founding Act, which I participated in negotiating in 1996-97. And naively, I thought that we had settled this issue of under what conditions and how NATO should proceed to welcome countries that wished to be associated with NATO. Well, turns out to be wrong. So I mention all of this simply to say that what we're talking about here tonight, and I'm sure what Michael is going to talk about in just a minute, it's not some abstract academic issue. It is what we are fighting about right now. It is about whether the future of Ukraine will be seen by future historians as an additional loss for the Western ideals, not only a loss for those in Ukraine who believed that they had a right to be a sovereign country pursuing their own ideals, or whether the opposite will come true. So this is a very, very large issue right now. And I'm very happy to have you here with us, Michael. Michael Abramowitz, can I say that, comes from a very prominent family. I knew his father quite well, who was a fellow diplomat. Whenever I showed up anywhere in Washington, Mordor Abramowitz was already there. I ran into him all the time during my tenure as State Secretary in Berlin and then as ambassador in Washington. And Freedom House is one of those American-based institutions that play a global role because of their credibility, because of the facts that they have established over time, and because of the story they tell. Founded during World War II, with Eleanor Roosevelt among the initial honorary chairs. And I quote from the founding mission, "Freedom House is founded on the core conviction that freedom flourishes in democratic nations where governments are accountable to their people." Before starting to work with and to running Freedom House in 2017, Michael was associated with the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and before that, of course, as most of you I'm sure know, he had a long career in journalism, serving in a number of roles with the Washington Post, etc., etc. So before handing over to Michael for his presentation and then for a Q&A session, let me say that this is, of course, is this actually on the record or is this Chatham House? I don't know. It's on the record. Good. So it's on the record. If you, those of you who are with us via Zoom, there's an opportunity for you to participate in the Q&A session via the chat function. And I think I will be given a tablet later on to bring you in if you wish to participate. I don't think I forgot anything essential to say before handing over to Michael. Michael Abramowitz, you have the floor. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Islinger. It's really an honor to be introduced by one of the deans of the German diplomatic service. And I particularly appreciate that the chairman of the Munich Security Forum, which I think is a place where military and national security issues are dealt with, recognizes the importance of democracy in foreign policy. So thank you, sir, for that kind introduction. I'm also very sorry that Dan is not here. He's been my friend for 40 years. I'm very grateful for him inviting me to the Academy this spring. After a couple of false starts due to the pandemic, here I am, and I'm looking forward to convening with Dan in a few weeks, the Holbrooke Forum. And I did want to say just a quick word about Richard. This institution, after all, is a testament to his vision when he was ambassador to Germany in the early 1990s. I was lucky to know Richard and count him as a friend, and I often think of Richard many times in my job. His extraordinary energy, his brilliant diplomatic skills, how he would fearlessly throw himself at the great challenges of the moment, whatever they were. I really wonder how he would have addressed the issue tonight that we're dealing with, which is the rise of authoritarianism that we face today. Whatever his response, it would have been interesting, and he would have broken a fair amount of diplomatic porcelain along the way. Democracy lost another one of its fiercest champions last week with the passing of Madeleine Albright. And I just want to say a word about Secretary Albright. I will remember Madeleine for many things, particularly her incredible story as a refugee from totalitarianism, who became the first woman to serve as Secretary of State, but also, and you saw this in many of the remembrance of her in the last week or so, her incredible kindness and loyalty, particularly to younger people, women in her orbit, and I was lucky enough to be a bit part of her orbit. Several years ago, I asked Secretary Albright to speak with reporters about the latest edition of, I think it was the 2017 or 2018 version of Freedom in the World, which is our, as Wolfgang said, our flagship publication. And during the interview, one of the interviews, a journalist asked her why Americans should care about supporting democracy around the world, given all the challenges that we have in our own countries. And her answer has really stuck with me ever since. America is better off, she said, and Americans are better off if our country is surrounded by other democracies. Countries with undemocratic governments, she said, are petri dishes for terrorism, violence, and instability. And as such, they pose a fundamental threat to our economic and national security interests. So for one example of just how right she is, just look at the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on gas prices, both here in Europe and in America. So we gather at a historic moment. The Russian regime's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine is not just an attack on Ukraine's sovereignty and freedom, but it's also an assault on basic democratic principles and a threat to freedom everywhere. I don't believe it is alarmist to say that the awful consequences of this war, children lying dead in the streets, bombed out apartments and hospitals, school teachers on the front lines, millions of displaced people and refugees, are just a taste of what the world could be like without any checks on anti-democratic behavior. The Russian invasion is one of the great tragedies of our time, but the resistance from Ukrainians, this democratic David holding its own against an autocratic Goliath, is also one of the greatest beacons of hope for democracy that I have seen in many years. The Ukrainian people have experienced the difference between freedom and repression, and they refuse to live under another tyrant. The invasion has also rekindled a spirit of democratic solidarity that has proved all too lacking in recent years. The unity that many free countries have shown during this conflict, not just in Europe and NATO, but around the world, is remarkable. And the question that I'm going to grapple with tonight is, can we seize the moment and marshal this unity in pursuit of a larger purpose? And could this horrific war be the inflection point where democratic societies come together to stem the tide of authoritarian expansion and trigger a new wave of democratic renewal? So Wolfgang stole a little bit of my thunder about Freedom House, but for the last 5 years, I've had the privilege to lead Freedom House, an organization whose mission it is to help create a world where all people can enjoy the full array of political rights and civil liberties that they are owed. We work with civil society organizations, with human rights activists, and journalists all over the globe, pushing governments to enact pro-democracy policies and protect human rights, and raising the alarm about emerging threats. Freedom House was created to confront one of history's greatest authoritarian threats, the echoes of which we hear today. In 1941, we're celebrating our 80th anniversary this year, even though it's really our 81st, but last year was kind of a wash. A bipartisan group of leaders in the United States, politicians, business leaders, labor leaders, journalists, and academia, they came together under the Freedom House banner to resist calls for American isolationism and to push the American people, the American government, to join the fight against fascism. Our most prominent patrons were political rivals. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, a Democrat, and Republican Wendell Willkie, who in 1940 had challenged FDR for the presidency. And they banded together, imagine that today, they banded together to advocate for a cause far greater than partisan competition. At that time, the Axis powers were advancing across Europe and Asia, and yet, and I find this interesting from my time at the Holocaust Museum, an overwhelming majority of Americans still told pollsters, 9 in 10, that their country should not send its own troops to fight. Isolationism had broad support among business leaders, politicians, ordinary citizens who shared a genuine conviction that intervention was a zero-sum game, that we could either send aid and support the Allies or strengthen America's own defenses. And that view was simply wrong. It's wrong then, and it's wrong today. It took the devastating Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 to make people understand that tyranny everywhere threatens democracy. That tyranny anywhere threatens democracy everywhere. In January of 1942, one of Freedom House's founders, the journalist Herbert Agar, wrote to Mrs. Roosevelt on behalf of the fledgling organization, and he did not mince words. America, he said, is in danger today because when she was safe, she did not help protect the safety and freedom of others. We obviously live today in a different era than the founders of Freedom House, but the challenges we face are no less dangerous and perhaps even more vexing. For many years, we have been experiencing what the scholar Larry Diamond has termed a global democratic recession. Every year since 1973, our flagship report, Freedom in the World, has assessed the state of political rights and civil liberties in every country and territory in the world. And for the first part of that landmark study, 3 decades or so, we had mainly good news to report. The collapse of military regimes in Spain and Latin America, the demise of the Soviet Empire, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the steady adoption of democratic practices on every continent. By the early 2000s, the outlook for freedom, human rights, and democracy was quite good, actually. So good, in fact, that some people believed we had entered a new phase of human history in which liberal democracy would become the final form of government for all nations eventually. But just a few years later, progress stalled and then reversed. And there are various explanations for this, economic, social, technological, but the general direction is all too clear. According to Freedom in the World, every year for the past 16 years, democracy has been in decline and authoritarianism has been on the rise. Throughout this period, dictators have taken advantage of our hope and our complacency to studiously chip away at our collective and individual freedoms, largely unchallenged by the international community. Last year, according to the report we just issued in February, only 25 countries recorded improvements in political rights and civil liberties. More than twice that many, 60, suffered declines. As you can probably guess from that number, the declines over the years have not just been limited to authoritarian countries like Turkey, Russia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, China. Democracies have also been affected, too. Places like Poland, Hungary, and India, the most populous democracy in the world. And we all know too well, sadly, that democracy has eroded in the United States as well. These declines are especially staggering when you consider this in terms of humanity as a whole. Freedom House categorizes all nations as either free, partly free, or not free. And today, less than 20% of all people live in a free country. That's the lowest percentage in 2 decades, roughly. It means that fewer than 1 in 5 people enjoy the freedoms of speech, association, and religion, government transparency, free and fair elections, the rule of law, and the other fundamental rights that we often take for granted in the United States and Germany. The stories of Russia and Ukraine in recent decades illustrates the larger global pattern. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, both nations struggled to democratize and rebuild their economies. Both generally moved in a more liberal and open direction, establishing partnerships with NATO and the European Union, opening themselves to global trade and cultural exchange, and working towards credible elections. But eventually their paths diverged. One continued in fits and starts to strive for democracy, freedom, and global integration. The other, driven by a new and anti-democratic leader, regressed into a hardened autocracy that tightly controls the media, assassinates dissidents at home and abroad, and invades its neighbors when they attempt to align themselves with the world's democracies. Since Vladimir Putin took power in the year 2000, he has dismantled the independent news outlets. He's co-opted and subdued judges who might have checked his absolute power, smeared and outlawed civil society groups, and converted the country's business magnates into cronies dependent on his whims. By 2021, Ukraine remained what we at Freedom House would consider a partly free country, still making difficult progress towards a more robust form of democracy, while Russia has become one of the least free countries in the world. And even worse, Russia is now working aggressively to spread its anti-democratic influence beyond its borders. Of course, the Kremlin is far from the only threat to global democracy. No discussion of modern authoritarianism can exclude the staggering human rights violations and growing international clout of the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. In the past decade under President Xi, the situation for political rights and civil liberties has gone from very bad to even worse. In 2014, around the time that President Xi took office, China had a freedom in the world score of 17 out of 100. Now the score is 9. And as we saw with the brutal crackdown on pro-democracy movements and independent media in Hong Kong, CCP repression is not limited to the mainland. In fact, the true extent of the party's global reach and influence is only starting to come into focus. Beijing is the world's most egregious perpetrator what we at Freedom House call transnational repression. The CCP runs a sprawling, sophisticated effort to pressure and control Chinese people overseas, especially dissidents, journalists, former party officials, and members of ethnic and religious minority groups. This isn't entirely new. The Chinese government has long sought to intimidate Uyghurs, Tibetans, Falun Gong practitioners, and political dissidents. But since Xi Jinping became president, these efforts have ramped up considerably. The Chinese government has also taken to punishing foreign countries, corporations, and even individuals for crossing political red lines. For example, by expressing support for freedom in Hong Kong and Taiwan, or condemning the Uyghur genocide. The very idea that the Olympics were recently hosted by a government that is committing genocide is stunning. It's encouraging that some countries adhered to a diplomatic boycott of the Games, the United States included, but the International Olympic Committee should be ashamed of itself for once again rejecting any normative approach to its decision-making. All eyes are on Ukraine at this point, and rightly so, but we must not lose sight of the broader threat to democracy posed by Xi Jinping and other authoritarians around the globe. The international response to President Putin's invasion provides some cause for hope. Hope that democratic countries and institutions are recognizing the fragility of the rules-based international order and the fact that we must do a great deal more together to protect it. In less than 2 months, we have seen an unprecedented and long overdue crackdown on Russian oligarchs, employing targeted sanctions and the freezing of overseas assets, which corrupt officials have used for many years to launder their ill-gotten gains. Breaking with decades of policy, Germany has launched a major defense buildup, and Sweden and Finland are deepening their cooperation with NATO. And while there are still some very important countries sitting on the sidelines, I am heartened that more than 140 countries in the UN General Assembly voted to condemn the invasion. Even Switzerland, which for so long has been synonymous with neutrality, has imposed sanctions on Russian leaders and assets. I should also note that the international business community, which has typically resisted pressure to get serious about human rights violations in the countries where they operate, may be awakening to the dangers of investment in authoritarian countries, to the point that they're abandoning Russia and even rethinking their presence in China. None of this will matter, however, unless democracies adopt a much more ambitious and comprehensive strategy to defend the principles of free self-government, not just in Ukraine, but around the world. And to do that, far more governments and government officials must recognize, as did Madeleine Albright, that they cannot secure their own national interests without also protecting and supporting democracy globally. Last year, a task force of Freedom House, the McCain Institute, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington published a report like this report that was aimed at the U.S. government about how to put democracy and human rights at the core of America's foreign policy. There's one line from the group's report that I find particularly striking, and I reread the report recently, and I quote, "We cannot take for granted that democracy's virtues are self-evident. We must make the case that democracies deliver dignity, security, and prosperity." And that's not an always easy case to make in recent years, especially to young people who associate democracy promotion with war in Iraq or a disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan by the United States, or who consider democracy perhaps a distraction from other global challenges like climate change. We also face resistance from some political leaders who believe that democracy and human rights should take a back seat to more traditional priorities like defense and economics. And while that resistance can be frustrating, it forces us to really think about why we're fighting for democracy. Authoritarians are out there making their case, peddling the line that a monolithic state is stronger, simpler, safer. They argue falsely that their systems deliver more for people than democracy can. So we have to make the case for democracy's real benefits. Unlike dictatorships or absolute monarchies, which force an entire country into the service of an individual or a family, democracy is designed to serve as many people as possible within a society. Democracy operates according to the will and consent of the governed, with institutions that are accountable to the people and rooted in the rule of law. No democracy is perfect, and the United States is no exception, as last year's insurrection at the Capitol sadly made clear. But all democracies have something that autocracies lack, which is self-correcting mechanisms that empower citizens to call their government to task when it fails to perform. And these institutions, from a free press to competitive elections and independent courts, give democracy a remarkable resilience, allowing our societies to strive consistently and peacefully toward the fulfillment of our highest ideals. President Biden has rightly described the defense of democracy as, quote, the defining challenge of our time. And so we must put these lofty words into action. There is no silver bullet. If there were, I think we would have used it already. But this is a generational struggle that will require an all-of-government approach, with each state with each democracy working closely with civil society and with each other to advance democracy. We'll have to try dozens of tactics and accept that many will fail. We will take 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 2 steps sideways. The advance of democracy is rarely linear. I'd like for a moment to highlight some of the approaches that I think might have the biggest effect. First and foremost, we must strengthen democracy at home by bolstering our democratic institutions, especially free and fair elections, assuring the freedom of the press, and by protecting the human and civil rights of all members of society. There are truly dangerous anti-democratic movements within our countries, dedicated to undoing decades of progress, willing to use violence and electoral malfeasance to gain power. And we know that once they have power, they will do anything they can to keep it. The issue is especially pertinent for the United States, still a free country, but one whose democracy has been troubled in recent years under both Democratic and Republican administrations. Despite its shortcomings, our country is a cornerstone for global democracy, and that's a weighty responsibility. Pro-democracy movements look to us for support and inspiration. And at the same time, authoritarians and aspiring dictators point to our mistakes as proof that democracy itself is flawed or as a cover for their own abuses. I'll focus on the United States because that's where I'm from, but this idea is equally important for European countries. We cannot possibly hope to protect democracy around the world if we cannot maintain it at home. The second point I would like to highlight is the need to bolster our democratic institutions against external threats by making our open societies more resistant to attacks and less prone to exploitation by anti-democratic forces. Authoritarian powers are using the openness of our system to undermine it, flooding social media platforms with disinformation, hiding their ill-gotten gains in our financial systems, and influencing our elected officials, often with the assistance of local lawyers, real estate agents, and financial experts. We need to enact smart, tailored regulations to protect Internet users from dangerous disinformation, while also upholding free expression, the global exchange of information, and individual privacy. We need to close legal loopholes that enable autocrats to inject their wealth into our countries without any taxation or oversight, polluting and corrupting our democracies. In fact, let's combat any improper influence by special interests in government, whether they are foreign or domestic in nature. Openness and transparency are 2 of democracy's greatest assets, but we must be vigilant to ensure that they are applied actively in the public interest and not neglected to the point that they can be turned against us. President Biden has declared corruption to be a threat to United States national security. And while this is an issue that our individual countries can take on individually, it is ultimately a cross-border challenge that we can only meet together. The effectiveness of our country's coordinated sanctions against the Russian leadership in just the past several weeks is proof of that. And to build on this momentum, democratic governments should pursue vigorously an anti-corruption agenda in multilateral organizations, such as the United States, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. If we can strip autocrats of their wealth and cut off the systems that authoritarian regimes use to get around sanctions, we'll create space for democratic movements and leaders to succeed. Third, we must invest our own resources to provide more material and diplomatic support and solidarity to pro-democracy activists and human rights defenders around the world. Democracy cannot be imposed on a country from the outside. True change comes from the grassroots, which is why Freedom House partners with local civil society organizations and independent media to help them keep working even in the most challenging circumstances. New requests from embattled journalists and social activists seeking emergency help from Freedom House come into our offices every day. And unbelievably brave people in Ukraine, Venezuela, China, and all over the globe are risking everything fighting for freedom and democracy not just for themselves, but for all of us. Finally, we must do everything we can to support President Zelensky and all the Ukrainians in their heroic struggle against authoritarian aggression. The stakes in Ukraine, and for all of us, are enormous. We are literally watching the battle between democracy and tyranny playing out in the Ukraine landscape. Our own countries have certainly not been disinterested bystanders in this contest, but we can do more. And the struggle of our lifetime is now underway here in Europe, and we must rise to the occasion. Democracy is facing an existential challenge in the expansion of authoritarianism, and for too long we have fallen short in our response. Problems of this magnitude do not fix themselves. Authoritarian regimes don't automatically crumble under the pressure of an, quote, arc of history bending towards justice, as Dr. King once said. People fix problems. People stand up to confront, even change repressive governments. I have been heartened in recent years by the extraordinary demand for democracy and human rights demonstrated by ordinary citizens around the world. In Hong Kong, millions of citizens flooded the streets to protest the erosion of their civil liberties under Beijing's influence. In Sudan, a movement of young professionals toppled a brutal dictator who stands accused of genocide against his own people. Even in Russia, where repression is heading in a Stalinist direction, dissent continues. And just this week, Dmitry Petrenko, a city council member in Siberia, was detained after making anti-war posts condemning the Ukraine invasion on social media. That such small acts of defiance are met with brutality and repression does not diminish their significance. And it is this, the persistent willingness of ordinary citizens to risk their lives and livelihoods to protest oppressive regimes, that tells me that the demand for freedom is only getting stronger. So I've laid out what we need to do to make these aspirations a reality: strengthen democracy at home, protect our open societies from exploitation, and support grassroots democracy movements and human rights defenders worldwide, and especially at this moment in Ukraine. I hope I've made it clear that I think we need to do this together as transatlantic allies and partners. The United States and its fellow democracies in Europe overcame staggering odds more than once to defend freedom in the world. We can and we must do it again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have now something like 45 minutes or so, certainly more than half an hour, for a Q&A session. And you covered a significant number of issues, so thank you so much for that. Let me use my role as moderator to throw out an initial question before we turn to our friends here in the room on the Ukraine war, on Russia. Two questions. We've all been, those of us who live here in Germany or in the EU, we've all been concerned about the growing polarization, political polarization in American society and in American politics. So tell us how you think this war, the fight against Russia, of course, is led essentially by the United States. Does this war offer a chance for American politics to come together again, to heal at least partly some of these totally polarized issues that have been cause for such great concern here in Europe? That's my first question. The second question is a simpler one. I've been amazed by our inability, collective inability, to do anything about public opinion in Russia. All the polling data that I've seen before the outbreak of hostilities, but even more since the outbreak of hostilities, appear to demonstrate that the Russian population has successfully been led to believe that this war started by Russia is a just war, and that Russia is on the good side, and Russia has a good reason to start this war, and that actually support for Vladimir Putin has grown, not dwindled, over the last 4 or 5 weeks. So why are we so totally, why do we seem to be so totally unable to influence in any way by technical means, by media, or I don't know what other means are at our disposal, to tell the average Russian that he's been brainwashed? Do we simply have to shrug our shoulders and accept it as it is, or am I missing something? So these are my 2 initial questions.
Well, thank you for those questions. They both are kind of profound questions. I'll take them in order. So first of all, as I said in my talk, I do think that the invasion, and particularly the incredible resistance of the Ukrainian people, which I think was not really expected, certainly by Mr. Putin and by many other analysts, outside Russia, offers a potential inflection point. And I do think, and I have been heartened on the specific question that you asked, that in the United States, I do think that you see some of the traditional divisions that have been taking place over the last, or some of the divisions, I wouldn't say they're traditional, because in some ways they're new, but that the divisions that have taken place over the last, number of years on this issue may be blurring a bit. I certainly feel that on Ukraine, you've got people, Mitt Romney and Ted Cruz and many others. They'll be critical of Biden for political reasons, but they are very much, supportive of aggressive action to support Ukraine. In fact, the Congress, if you see some of their proposals, are want to push the administration maybe farther than they want to go. I would say I'm not totally surprised at that from the point of view of Freedom House, because I think one thing that's interesting to me during the time of the Trump administration, and there was a lot of divisions within my own country about our own democracy. But when you look beyond our shores, there was actually quite a bit of commonality between many Republicans and Democrats about the need to support democracy overseas. I think about, on the one hand, someone like Speaker Pelosi, who is a fierce champion of human rights, and then also Lindsey Graham, who, whatever you think about his domestic politics, is a very strong supporter of, in the McCain tradition, of freedom and human rights. So, and I think it's interesting that the National Endowment for Democracy, which is, one of our major institutions funding support for democracy, that had a huge increase in its budget during the Trump administration because of its strong support on a bipartisan basis for democracy. So I think for democracy overseas. So I'm kind of hopeful that this could be an inflection point, but American politics being what they are, it's dangerous to bet against continuing polarization and gridlock. On your question about the Russian people and why do they think what they think and what to do, I think what's very interesting to me in general about the advance of technology is that it has actually given an advantage to the bad guys. So if you think about Tahrir Square 10 years ago, and you think about the way everyone was writing at the time that Facebook was going to be a liberating technology and was going to enable the toppling of dictators everywhere, that it's not turned out to be that way. The Chinese have pioneered this more than the Russians, the great Chinese firewall. They are able to block, almost any kind of independent information from getting inside China. Unless you have a VPN in China, unless you know where to look, what you're getting, you're blocked from information. And I think Russia is moving in a very similar direction right now. And I think the truth is that we don't really know what the Russian people think about this. I think polling is very uncertain in an authoritarian setting. What people think, I don't personally really know. I suspect that the premise of your question is correct, that people in Russia largely support Putin. But as time goes on, will this be Putin's Afghanistan? There's going to be, over time, there are going to be dead soldiers coming home, and there's going to be bad news that's seeping into this. So I agree with you that right now it's a big challenge, and I think the issue, that's why I think that supporting independent journalists, getting information into the hands of people really has to be a big part of the strategy for protecting democracy.
We have, in the context of the Munich Security Conference, we have a young tradition, the last 6 or 8 or 9 years, of bringing together each year a group of young professionals, journalists, young business leaders, politicians, academics, under the heading of, Munich Security Conference Next Generation. One of the members of this group a few years ago was a Russian journalist, a female journalist with Kommersant, one of the Russian newspapers. And I just heard a couple of days ago that she and her entire editorial team, all the reporters, they're now being closed down. They cannot report about the war in Ukraine in any meaningful way. For example, by showing pictures of the devastation that's going on. So this is, of course, terrible. Let's open it up now. We'll go to the room here first, and then I'll try to call on a few of the people who are participating virtually. Let's study. If you could please identify yourselves, because I don't know all of you personally. So please identify yourself briefly for the benefit of Mike. Please.
Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Joseph Pearson. I work at a university here, the Barenboim Said Academy, which is a peace project. I have a question about the principle of sovereignty as a precondition for moving forward in the spread of human rights, democracy in the world. You hinted at this in your talk, a disillusion of young people looking at failures in Afghanistan, Iraq, the sense that there is this violation of sovereignty in Ukraine by Russia, and yet democracies looking at their own record around the world, there is this sense of, do they have the moral high ground anymore? My question is what to do with this, especially when, certainly I feel the incredible need to spread freedom, to spread human rights, and yet that feels for many people interventionist in some way. How do we reconcile all these things?
It's a great question. So let me a couple of immediate thoughts. Number one is, I think, and Wolfgang and I were talking about this a little bit before, for obvious reasons, the U.S. invasion of Iraq has cast a huge pall over this issue. It was not a campaign that was waged for democracy, although after the fact they talked about that. But I think that has created a huge kind of credibility gap for many around the world that we have to acknowledge. And I think Afghanistan has contributed to that. The situation in Libya during the Obama administration, I think these are all making it hard to convince people.
And I think, so that's point number one. I think we have to acknowledge the truth of what you're saying. I think number two, I think we also have to recognize that there is much that can be done non-militarily. The report that I referenced in my talk at Freedom House was full of dozens of recommendations. Sanctions, public diplomacy, supporting independent media, supporting human rights activists. I really encourage you to take a look at it. There were no military recommendations to that. No, people recognize that democracy, it's very difficult to be obtained at the point of a bayonet. The third point I would say, though, is that I do think that Ukraine I think, hopefully will kind of crystallize the issues for many people in the world. We can be very critical of our own government, and Freedom House, I'm very proud of, does not just point fingers at other governments, but we also look at our own. If you look at our report, we have a whole chapter on the U.S., just as we have a chapter on Turkey, and it's all out there. However, I think the events of Ukraine kind of put things in a little bit of context. I mean, we still have the ability here in Germany or in the United States to protest vigorously and complain. And the press, I'm a former journalist, we have the freest legal system for the press in the whole world. And you have in Ukraine a dictator by using kind of brute force to basically undermine democracy, essentially. And I think we have to remind ourselves, like what we in democracies are up against. So, yes, be critical, but recognize where the real threats are coming from. That would be my view.
Might I respond just quickly?
Please.
I was reading recently, again, Stefan Zweig's Die Welt von Gestern, The World of Yesterday, and he speaks that before the Second World War, Europe was in a drowsy, somehow, took things for granted. And your last point reminds me of that, this feeling that maybe we're waking up now to what we have and what we care about and what we feel is important to protect in a way that we haven't done for a very long time.
Yes.
It's particularly true, by the way, if I may intervene here. It's particularly true for the Germans. Germany was a non-status quo country until 1989-90. Our constitution required us to be against the status quo, against the partition of Germany, trying to overcome that. So in 1990, that was achieved. And as a consequence of that, at least in my view, the Germans developed a love affair with the status quo. They said, now, and I'm guilty of this myself because I was a speechwriter for a while for my superiors, the foreign minister, the chancellor at the time. And we put this sentence into so many speeches. Now we are only surrounded by friends, which was not a wrong sentence to say or to write down, but it created the wrong impression that, that the end of history had been reached and there was now paradise beginning. And so the Germans have had such a particularly hard time waking up right now because they had been so deeply in this love affair with the status quo for the last almost 30 years. Things are fine the way they are. Why do we need the military? We don't have any adversaries. We're only, even the countries that we used to be at war with, from France to Poland to the former Soviet Union, they're now partners. That was a deep conviction. So for the Germans, it's a particularly hard waking up process. I think much harder than it is for some of our eastern neighbors who lived in a more in a mindset that was probably more dominated by realism than our own for the last couple of decades. Sorry for interrupting. The next speaker was the lady in the... Yes, please. Identify yourself, please.
Retired old... I'm Brigitte Döring, retired old United Nations hand. I listened very carefully to to your comments about all that democracy has to offer the world, and I fully agree with that. I wonder to what extent Freedom House has also looked into what makes autocrats attractive. Because I think there's too little effort spent on analyzing that. Why are people convinced by what they are telling them? My own idea is that there are always problems people have that are not solved, and they're looking for answers to somebody who offers them a simple answer. Democracy usually puts forward very complicated or more complicated solutions to the problems of the world, whether they be economic, environmental, or what have you. And so the temptation to listen to a simple solution is rather great. And perhaps that is a tact where that democracy should focus on, to say, how can we communicate better or be more creative about solutions to the problems that the world is facing, and therefore make autocrats unattractive or unnecessary, because we are offering solutions. Does your institution do any research along those lines?
Well, we've certainly tried to analyze what's been happening over the last 50 years. A couple points come to mind, and I think it's a great question. The first point I would make is that it seems to me that, well, first of all, there have been literally hundreds of books that have been written in the last 5 years about trying to explain, this phenomenon of rising authoritarianism, declining democracy. I'm persuaded that one major factor is, the inability of democracies, of democratic governments to deal with some of the economic challenges that our societies have faced. And I think that there is a connection between the economic dislocations of 2008, 2009, that period, that you can see leading to Brexit, leading to President Trump and the rise of other populists, because I think democracy did not deliver in the minds of many citizens. I think it provided an opening for people who are, potentially, offering simple or incorrect solutions or bad analysis to problems. By the way, I think it's a perfectly fine thing for populists to challenge the conventional wisdom. I mean, that's the purpose of having elections. But I think the question is, what we've seen in both left-wing and right-wing populist governments is that the populists then try to hold on to power and try to not have a fully contested election. I mean, so I think it'd be one thing if they were allowed to have their chance to run the country, and if they fail, they could be voted out. But there's a rigging of the system that's going on. So I think that's one point. The other thing that I would say, your question prompts me to think a bit about the whole issue of the role of the media, the role of truth, the role of the media ecosystem. So my career was largely, for the first half of it, as a journalist, and I came of age during a time when it was a completely different media environment in my country. There was 4 or 5 major national papers. There were 3 networks, and that was pretty much it. And so, the internet has completely democratized information. And by the way, that's not all a bad thing. There are opportunities for many voices that were shut out of previous debates to get into the game and have their and have their voice heard. And I think that's very important. But I do think that this issue of having a common set of facts that we can all agree on, we really, in my country, which I can speak most to, we have different media ecosystems. And it's very difficult to, it's very hard to persuade people of anything right now in my country. Even whether the election was stolen or not. It clearly was not stolen, but there's nothing that we can say to convince half the population that it wasn't stolen. So that issue of the media system and the ability to kind of shape narratives, I do think if the fascists of yesterday had control of the internet and Twitter, things would have been sadly different. It's a very powerful platform for dictators.
Let's take one question from the tablet here. This question comes from Ruth Lincoln, and I'll read it to you, Michael. Could you discuss the balance? This is about Poland and Hungary, and the struggle that we have with them. Could you discuss the balance of working with Poland and Hungary in support of the Ukraine struggle and addressing the anti-democratic issues in Poland and Hungary? So this is our European dilemma. How do we deal with, the unity that we now have, at least with Poland, in confronting the Russians on Ukraine, and at the same time the legal and constitutional issues that have divided us and continue to divide us?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me just first say, I do think at Freedom House, I think we see Poland and Hungary differently. I think they've both been anti-democratic tendencies, but I think it's further down the road in Hungary than in Poland. I think it's a much more competitive situation in Poland than it is in Hungary. I mean, this group may know better. I don't know whether Prime Minister Orban is going to, it seems like he will likely hold on to power again, and he, who knows, but he's someone who has actually been able to kind of almost rig the system. We talk about gerrymandering in our country. His country is very much gerrymandered. So, but my only point here for this question is that I think that Poland is in a better place with the democracy than Hungary. I think there's a difference there. Although I don't downplay the issues with the courts and with the media. Although there have been a few things that they've pulled back from in recent months. I think it's I don't know the answer. I've been thinking about this because Poland has been totally the ally of all of us in really being a major source of support and strength against Russian aggression.
And taking in hundreds of thousands of refugees.
Absolutely. It's incredible for a government that was really kind of hostile to immigration. So maybe this will. I'm not sure. I don't know the answer, Wolfgang. I think it's going to be. Maybe this will again, hopefully, remind Polish leaders of the value of democracy and what we're fighting for. But they certainly have stood up with respect to the current challenges.
I mean, one thing that we can say even now, after 4 weeks or 5 weeks of this war, it has certainly eliminated the idea of NATO being brain dead. It has eliminated the idea of the European Union being about to fall apart. It has reinvigorated, in my view at least, the idea that there is something that deserves to be called the West in terms of values and unity of purpose, etc., represented by your institution, among many others. And it's all been promoted by one person by the name of Vladimir Putin. I mean, it's really interesting. I think in 2014, the idea of national identity of Ukraine was not universally popular throughout Ukraine. Ukraine was a multinational and multi-ethnic country with the Russians and the Ukrainians, etc. But because of the Russian activities beginning in 2014, the country has really, and I'm so, as a diplomat, I'm so surprised that the Russians seem to have missed the boat on this, that they've not understood that Ukraine of 2022 is not the Ukraine of, let's say, 2012 or so, of a decade ago. It's a totally different country with a sense of national identity, promoted by and pushed forward by the Russian aggression. I mean, it's really very interesting phenomenon. More questions, more comments. Yes, please.
Thank you, Michael. I am born and raised in China and based in New York now. So my question would be, do you imagine the use of the word democracy could possibly have a little bit more leniency and a freedom?
More what?
Use leniency and more freedom of reimagination of when we are talking about democracy. Because if it feels very the West definition of democracy, and if we are only talking about using one definition of what democracy could mean, and perhaps we could not begin this dialogue with the Chinese government, especially with the people from China, for instance, or in Russia. If we don't care for the people who live in that nation or on that land, if we were only talking about democracy in the West definition, yes, we can say, because the three definitions with freedom of speech and organization, but I do believe that everyone's idea for their nation and for their freedom, because it's all about, as we learn, all about context and all about the words you're using. So maybe we are not starting from the same place. So I'm just asking, when we are only listening to this narrative that the Xi government, the Putin, the Trump, but it feels that we are not talking about the people who live on the land, still are facing all these problems. So when the people are in that land, are hearing that narrative, and they don't hear that with that definition of democracy. And so maybe my question is, in today's world, can we reimagine what that democracy could really be?
So let me give you a couple thoughts on that. Thank you very much for the question. First of all, I would never say, and I hope I didn't convey this in my talk, that there's only one form of democracy. So, India is a democracy. They have ways of doing democracy. The United States has certain traditions. Germany has different traditions. South Africa has its own version. I think democracy is going to take, shape in many different ways, and I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all, way that democracy has to be. I do think, however, that there are certain, and I believe they're universal, there are certain elements of democracy that are just foundational. One is really no other way of saying the consent of the governed, that people have the right to choose their own rulers, that there has got to be a free press, an independent press. There's got to be freedom of religion, freedom of speech. All these different things make up democracy, not just elections. That's actually a thing that we have to really guard against. It's not enough to have free elections. It's also, you also have to have these other elements of what I guess is commonly called liberal democracy. And I think that, it's interesting, the Chinese government and the Russian government I don't know if people here noticed, they wrote an op-ed, I think it was in the New York Times or the Washington Post in December, together saying, we're democracies too. And I did not find that convincing. But it did say to me that the power of the word democracy is still that they felt they had to defend their own systems as democracy. You know, the other thing that I would say is, you know, it's often, I truly do not believe that what I'm talking about is a Western construct. You know, some of the strongest democracies in the world, according to our report, are in Asia. South Korea, very strong democracy. Taiwan, incredibly strong democracy. But both those examples to me are very interesting because those countries really 30 years ago, when my father was a diplomat, they were dictatorships. And they are now among the most thriving, open, transparent democracies in the world. So I don't think the idea of a monopoly on power by the Chinese Communist Party with respect is democracy. That we don't know. I know you're from China. I respect your thoughts, but I think I don't presume to know what the Chinese people think or know under that system of government. I don't know.
But they will feel like there is a bloodshed coming to them.
Let me say that again.
They will feel there is a bloodshed coming to them.
A flush?
Bloodshed. Bloodshed coming to them. I'm sorry that I'm a little emotional right now,
yes.
Because these days, the Shanghai is experiencing a severe lockdown as we speak. So all of my friends and family members are behind locked doors.
Yes.
And that's a severe locked doors, not just New York locked doors. So everyone understand that. Everyone understand this idea, all these ideals that what we are actually discussing. So when they're listening to this, and they also, by the way, everyone can use VPN. They can get to the international news outlets. But what I'm saying is that what is the outcome for the people, for all these billions of people's outcome, if we only attacking one government? So what is the outcome if Putin be from Putin or to the Chinese government? Because if we just say, okay, this government is wrong, and we've been through that. We've been through dynasties that are going through all this changes of bloodshed, and it's billions of people's life gone. So democracy at what cost? Maybe is my question too.
Okay. Let's go to Dieter Grimm.
Let me go back for a moment to the previous question. I think you are right when you distinguish between Hungary and Poland. But you shouldn't be misled about the motives of Poland. Poland doesn't fight in this moment for democracy, but Poland fights because it expects or is afraid of being the next victim.
I agree with that. I should not have, yes.
Two more general remarks without being able now to explore more deeply in it. I think democracy is in a difficult situation at present because so many democracies present themselves in a very unattractive way. You alluded to that in your speech, and you admitted that this is the case even in your own country, which we all regret very much. But democracies are not very attractive. Many democracies, I don't want to blame everybody, are not a very attractive model. This is one side of our problem, and I think the second side of our problem is that, if I observe it correctly, there is a seminal change in the world against the possibility of various truths coexisting peacefully with each other. But a tendency that there is one truth, and it's always very often a very personal or a very interest-leaded truth, that has to prevail over all others. And this is the biggest enemy of the idea of democracy. And this is a seminal trend, and so this is why it is so difficult to fight against it. It will not last forever, but at the moment the wind blows against democracy.
Yeah.
You've asked a couple things. I mean, my one reaction, sir, to what you said is that I think the nature of democracy itself is incredibly messy, right? I mean, again, just look at the United States. By the way, we've been a deeply flawed democracy. We had slavery, we had Jim Crow, we had a civil war over this 150 years ago. So democracy is inherently a really messy situation. But I also think that in the end, as I tried to get to in my speech, the thing that's, it's funny, I had a conversation with a Washington Post friend of mine the other day, and we were talking about this, and he was, like, I was a little bit more negative about the trajectory of U.S. democracy, but he was saying, no way, because he had covered totalitarian states. And the thing that's true about the authoritarian totalitarian states is that you cannot, it's very difficult. There's no accountability mechanism, right? That where do the people go if they are unhappy with what their government is doing? There's no way to kind of hold the government accountable. But in democracies, there is that capacity to hold government accountable and to have self-renewal. And that's why, in the end of the day, I am hopeful in the long term about U.S. democracy, although it might take us a while to get to the long term.
Is it possible to think about democracy a little bit like the air we breathe? We take it for granted that there's always air to breathe. But if you have ever been in a situation, maybe as a diver, as a scuba diver, so when all of a sudden there is no oxygen available, you understand what you're missing in a very extreme, very extreme manner. And we haven't really, in our societies, we haven't really understood what that means. I was reminded of this just by way of an anecdote when I heard yesterday that an old friend of mine, the grandson of Andrei Gromyko, former Soviet foreign minister, his grandson was a mid-level researcher at the IMEMO, an institution within the Russian Academy of Sciences. And he and three others, including Sergei Rogov, a long-time, salt and start expert also, because they signed a very innocent appeal by defense and nuclear specialists from all over the world, they were now expelled from an advisory body to the Kremlin, day before yesterday, signed by Putin, all four of them, thrown out, just because they signed an academic piece of paper. That's the kind of stuff that we don't think would ever happen to us, but it does. We're beginning to run out of time. Here is one contribution by somebody by the name of Daniel Benjamin. Okay. And I'll read this to you, inviting your comment. The war in Ukraine is dramatic, but some of the democratic erosion has been the result of China's ability to win friends and ultimately indentured allies through foreign aid and investment such as the Belt and Road Initiative. In other words, money. How do we compete with that? It's hard to imagine Western democracies being able to compete with that kind of resource allotment. Yet it seems essential. What do you say to that?
Well, I would never disagree with Director Benjamin. Is it President Benjamin? Is he president too? Well, one point I wanted to say is that I think, and just going to the previous question by my fellow is about China. I do think I'd like to just distinguish between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. And I think that's an important point. I don't think it's one and the same, and we sometimes, I think, forget that. Number two, with respect to Dan's question, I think it's a good point. I think the Chinese government has been on a very deliberate campaign of winning friends and incurring support. I think that my perception, and again, here I'm a little bit on thin ground, is that this is not always well received, and I think that the Chinese government's it's been heavy-handed in some cases, and that there's been sort of a bit of a blowback against this idea, and I do think that at the end of the day, look, again, America can be criticized for many things, but and George W. Bush was criticized for many things, but this was a man who brought PEPFAR to Africa and helped save tens of thousands of lives in Africa because he cared about. And I don't think there was anything. And I think that the power of that example is still very strong. He's still kind of a popular guy in parts of Africa because of his effort to develop that efforts against malaria. So I do think that at the end of the day, I'm struck that there are many people who are refugees who are trying to come to my country, who are trying to go to Poland. They're going to Germany. Chancellor Merkel admitted 1 million, Syrian refugees. They're not going to other countries because I think that they understand by the way they're voting with their feet that they want to go to countries that they feel they can have an opportunity, and they feel that's better in democracies than in other countries.
That's a very strong argument, I think. I think we have time for 2 quick final questions, one here and then one way back on the other side. Please.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring conversation. My name is Jessica Gino-Hecht. I'm a historian at Freie Universität Berlin at the Kennedy Institute, and I have the privilege to be part of a cluster working on contestations of the liberal script, which of course is precisely what we're talking about here today. One thing that strikes me in this conversation, and that we actually talk about a lot in the cluster, is that we focus always on one of 2 things, which is internal and external contestations to the liberal script. So what is it internally that democracies generate that actually tries to destroy them, and then what are the external threats, such as Vladimir Putin? And I've been quite haunted, Wolfgang Ischinger, by your question in regard to why do we fail to cater to Russian public opinion in the last 5 weeks, which by extension is really a question about, and this goes back to the gentleman who talked earlier, why do democracies in general fail to sell themselves or to market themselves in a more favorable way? Now, in 1953, the Truman administration created under the impression of the Korean War, an institution that came to be known as the United States Information Agency, which then created a couple of spin-off projects which served essentially that very purpose, informing people behind enemy lines about America, about American foreign policy, about democratic values, and served that purpose very well for 50 years. And then one by one during the Clinton administration, they were essentially dismissed and meandered a little bit into public diplomacy before that was essentially outsourced increasingly to non-governmental organizations. The same actually has been true for other liberal states, including Germany. My question would be, do you see any chance, maybe under the impression of what is going on right now, that any of these institutions or institutions like those could be resuscitated or recreated in the sense that, yes, democracies fail to market themselves, period. That's been perpetually their failure. We need institutions to do that job. Our creed that democracies will be always attractive enough for others to simply fall under its spell has just not proven workable. We need institutions and individuals to do that full time. So do you see any chance in this country and in others, but particularly in your countries, which has such a broad experience in the sector of cultural diplomacy, to go back to that learning, to that lesson, and recreate institutions like that again? Thank you very much.
Your question is related to that, or is it totally different?
I can make it very quick.
Okay.
Thanks very much. And I'm Lauren Benton. I'm a fellow here this spring, and I'm from Yale University. So I've been puzzled that a couple of factors have not come up in the discussion about why we've done such a poor job conveying the values of freedom and democracy. And those conditions are structural inequality, persistent poverty, and in particular, a sense of relative deprivation with the skewing of wealth, income inequality, and especially the high profile of the, filthy rich. So my question is, why has this not come up? Are these not factors that you write about and consider in your research in Freedom House? These do strike me as very important, even in the analysis in the United States of why people supported Trump, and I assume that it's also a factor in Russia as well.
Okay. So a couple sort of different questions on the table. Let me just go to you, Lauren, first. I agree with you that inequality and rising inequality, I think, has probably been a major factor in this kind of democratic deterioration. So I agree with the premise of your question. I think what's interesting, if you read the last few Freedom House reports over the last couple of years, one of the major issues that is identified is that this is a kind of a global issue, and you're talking about it in terms of economic inequality, but I think it's also kind of there's been kind of an attack on the idea that government should represent all peoples. And so you think about a country like India, which is one of the proudest and oldest democracies, in the world, and terrible discrimination now faced by Muslims in India. That's been something that's been identified in the Freedom House report. So I agree with, I think you raised a good point. I didn't mention it. Actually, as my wife properly said to me when she read the speech beforehand, there wasn't too much on the analysis of the problem, but I agree with that. But the other point, coming to your question, I think there is a marketing issue potentially, but I want to first say, I think that, again, talking about the United States in particular, I think the most important pro-democratic thing the United States could do would be to kind of start passing legislation that is supported. If you look at polling, immigration, education, the economy, there's actually a lot of common ground among Americans on basic issues, but we've been unable to effectively deal with problems that people want solved. So I think the reality of actually practicing democracy is almost more important than the marketing of it. I will say, what came to mind from listening to your question is the issue of institutions like VOA, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia. Those are incredible institutions. And what's actually interesting about those institutions, and I say this not as a former journalist, is that they all actually practice real journalism. It's not about trying to, if you think about why we know about the Uyghurs situation today, it's because of Radio Free Asia has done incredible reporting about the Uyghur situation. VOA and, I'm thinking about, my friend Jamie Fly, who's the head of Radio Free Europe now, incredibly brave reporting about what's happening in Russia. It's one of the few places that has real independent reporting on what's happening. So it's not a matter of propaganda, but it's a matter of making sure that people around the world have accurate information about what's happening in their countries. I think that is a major problem for democracy. The absence of accurate, reliable information that's trusted by the population. If you think again in my own country, going back to that, there's a deep distrust in the media now. I hate that that's the fact, and I think part of that is manipulated, but part of that is also, the media problem. So I do think that I would say, in direct response to your question, building up those institutions like Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia would be a very strong pro-democracy move.
Great. We've run out of time. It's almost exactly 9 p.m., and I was supposed to end this at 9. Before we close, I've been asked to mention that the next event here will be tomorrow evening at 7:30, Daimler lecture titled, it's a good title for our current situation, Aggressive War, Atrocity, and the quote-unquote Verbrecherstaat by Daimler fellow Lawrence Douglas. He's not in the room, is he? No. Make a note of that. We hope that many of you will be there tomorrow evening. Thank you very much, Michael. If I may just offer one closing half sentence. As important it is that we do everything we can to tell the story about Western values and democracy, etc., etc. And I don't disagree with anything you've said. I think at the end of the day, it boils down to what we actually do.
Yes.
What we do. And remember, as far as this country is concerned, the reputation of Germany, whether one likes it as a German, whether one was against it or for it, let's leave that aside for a moment. The reputation of Germany in terms of its attachment to human rights issues, it's changed dramatically to the positive when we opened up the borders, whenever it was 6 or 7 years ago. So it depends also on what we actually do in defending our values and in implementing them when there are real challenges. So that's also important. Thank you very much, Michael. This was extremely interesting and most timely, and I hope you have a very good 3 weeks here in this town. I'm sure there are many waiting to meet with you and talk to you about the role of Freedom House, which has been such an extraordinary institution, being quoted over and over and over again. I'm sorry we don't have anything remotely coming close to Freedom House in terms of credibility and recognition. So thank you. Let's give a hand to our speaker.